On a Monday morning, May 15, 2024, a man with a gaunt, anxious face walked into the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Office in rural Georgia. He introduced himself as David Miller, and he was there to report the suspicious disappearance of his brother and nephew. The officer who took his report was Detective Sergeant Frank Russo, head of the Homicide Division. Noticing the gravity in the man's expression, he invited him into his office. David began, his voice thick with worry, telling the sergeant that his brother, Mike Miller, and his nephew, Kevin, who was 13, had been missing for 4 days. He explained that he had been trying to call both of them for days but could not get through. He added that the guys on Mike's masonry crew said they had not seen him since the previous weekend either. Sergeant Russo asked when he was last in contact with them. David replied that it was the previous Friday afternoon. His brother had called and said he was just going to stay home and rest over the weekend. David emphasized that Mike was a very responsible guy and would never just skip work or go somewhere without telling anyone. He was certain Kevin would not either, as he was a good kid studying for his final exams, so there was no reason he would just disappear like that. David paused, taking a deep breath as if to summon the courage to say the hardest part. He continued that yesterday, he was so worried he drove over to their house to check on things, but his sister-in-law, Sarah, was acting very calm. She said Mike had taken Kevin to Florida to visit an old army buddy who was seriously ill and that they had left in such a hurry they did not have time to tell him. The sergeant asked what about that explanation made him suspicious. David asserted that it was very suspicious. He explained that his sister-in-law's attitude was strange. Her husband and son were gone for days with no contact, and she did not seem worried at all. In fact, she seemed annoyed when he asked a lot of questions. Most importantly, David lowered his voice. The folks in their town had been gossiping a lot lately about an affair between his sister-in-law and a man named Rick Vance, who was on the same masonry crew as Mike. He added that people had seen him hanging around his brother's house a lot, and he was even there yesterday when he stopped by. He concluded by saying he was really scared something terrible had happened to his brother and nephew. David Miller's report immediately raised red flags. A double disappearance with conflicting details and the appearance of a third party, this was no longer a simple civil matter. Sergeant Russo immediately reported the situation to his superiors. A task force was formed on the spot, with its first mission to verify the information David had provided. Russo told his team that for now, they would treat this as a missing persons case. He ordered Team 1 to go with Mr. Miller to his brother's house and speak directly with Sarah Miller, instructing them to observe her demeanor and check her story. He ordered Team 2 to stay at the station to quickly verify the information about the army buddy in Florida and, at the same time, build a profile on Rick Vance and his connections. About an hour later, the first team arrived in the small community of Pine Ridge. The Miller family's modest bungalow sat quietly at the end of a small lane. When the team arrived, the scene was exactly as David had described. Rick Vance was sitting on the front porch, while Sarah Miller was in the yard doing laundry. Their presence together in the missing man's home on a weekday morning was, in itself, highly unusual. Seeing the police, and especially her brother-in-law, the expressions on both Sarah and Rick's faces shifted slightly. Sarah quickly wiped her hands on her shirt and walked over. Sergeant Russo greeted Mrs. Miller, stating they were from the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Office. He explained that they were there to follow up on a report from Mr. Miller regarding the disappearance of her husband and son and ask her to tell them where Mike and Kevin were at that moment. Sarah, though a bit flustered, stuck to her prepared script. She greeted the officers and explained that her husband and son had gone to Florida to visit one of his old army buddies who was very sick. She added that they left in a hurry, so they did not get a chance to let David know. She delivered the lines smoothly, as if she had rehearsed them. The sergeant then asked if she could give them the friend's name, address, or phone number so they could contact him for verification. At this, Sarah began to stammer, saying she was not really sure about that. She claimed she did not usually ask about his friends and that he just said he was in Florida, generally. Her attitude only deepened the investigators' suspicions, but they maintained neutral expressions. Just then, Sergeant Russo's phone vibrated. It was a call from Team 2 back at the station. He signaled for everyone to be quiet and answered. A detective's voice came through, reporting to the sergeant that they had run a quick check on Mike Miller's Army service records. He had one friend living in Florida, but they had just contacted the man's family, who confirmed he was in perfect health and had not had anyone named Mike or Kevin visit him in the past week. Russo hung up. He looked directly into Sarah Miller's eyes, his gaze sharp as ice. He told her they had just confirmed that her husband's friend in Florida was perfectly fine and had not seen them. He then asked if she would like to tell them the truth. Faced with this direct refutation, Sarah's calm facade began to crack. She turned pale, stammering incoherently that she did not know and that was what he had told her. Maybe he went somewhere else. Seeing this, Rick Vance stepped forward, speaking loudly, asking what they were doing trying to scare a woman like that. He stated it was their business and questioned how she was supposed to know where he goes. Rick's intervention only further convinced the investigators that these two were hiding a terrible secret. But suspicion was not evidence. Right now, all they had was a lie. They had no proof of a murder. Sergeant Russo knew he could not push it any further here. He made a decision, informing Mrs. Miller and Mr. Vance that he was asking them both to come down to the station to clarify some details related to the disappearance of Mike and Kevin Miller and presented them with a summons. The meeting at the house ended. Sarah and Rick were obligated to go with the police. David Miller was asked to stay behind to assist other officers in examining the house. On the way back to the station, Sergeant Russo sat in his car, his mind racing. The case had now officially shifted from a standard missing persons case to a criminal investigation. Sarah was clearly lying to cover something up. He spoke into his radio, ordering Team 1 to start a deep dive into Rick Vance's entire history and relationships, stating they needed to know who this guy really was. He instructed Team 2 to continue working with David Miller and other relatives to dig deeper into any conflicts within the victim's family, concluding that the case was definitely not simple. At the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Office, the first two interrogations of Sarah Miller and Rick Vance were conducted simultaneously but yielded no breakthrough. Both suspects, despite being confronted with proof of their blatant lies, remained incredibly stubborn. They knew that as long as the police had not found a body, they could not be charged with murder. Rick Vance, with the cunning of a seasoned liar, maintained a completely calm demeanor. He insisted he knew nothing about the disappearance of Mike and his son. With a nonchalant tone, he said he was being framed. He admitted that he and Sarah were having an affair and that it was their mistake, but he claimed to have no idea where Mike took his son. He stated he was not at her house that night and that David's statement was a lie because he had a grudge against him. He constructed a tight alibi, painting himself as an adulterer but innocent in a mysterious disappearance. Meanwhile, in the second interrogation room, Sarah Miller employed a different tactic. She cried continuously, playing the part of a pitiful wife and a mother grieving for her lost son. She sobbed that she really did not know where her husband and son went. She repeated that he had told her he was going to Florida and she believed him. Perhaps he did not go there and went somewhere else. She claimed her husband had always been impulsive and easily influenced by his friends, and that she was so worried. When questioned about her relationship with Rick, Sarah admitted to it but spun the story in another direction. She said she knew she was wrong, but she was just a lonely woman who did not get any attention from her husband. Rick was there to comfort her, and she was weak. She insisted it was just a momentary lapse and that she never intended to leave her husband and child for him. Both statements were full of contradictions but shared a single goal: to deny any involvement in the disappearance of the two victims. After nearly 8 hours of fruitless interrogation, with insufficient evidence to hold them on criminal charges, the sheriff's office was forced to release Sarah and Rick, but with an order not to leave the state or their residences. Sergeant Russo knew that releasing the two main suspects was a risky move, but it was required by law. However, a plan for tight, 24/7 surveillance on both of them was immediately put into action. Every movement, every call, every meeting was secretly monitored by detectives. In parallel, other investigative teams were working at full capacity. One team dug deeper into Rick Vance's background. The results showed a man with a complicated past. He had been married before back in his home state of Alabama but divorced after being caught cheating and abusing his wife. He also had significant gambling debts. He came to Georgia to work in construction but was known as a smooth talker who preyed on vulnerable women. A portrait of a deadbeat, greedy, and unscrupulous man began to emerge. Another team focused on the Millers' marriage. Through conversations with neighbors and close relatives, they learned that the couple's life was not as happy as it appeared. Mike was a good, kind man who loved his son, but he was also gruff and not good at communicating. Sarah, on the other hand, had high material desires and often expressed dissatisfaction, comparing her husband to other men. The conflict between them had been simmering for a long time. The investigation dragged on for days without a breakthrough. Sarah and Rick, after being released, were extremely cautious. They barely met or contacted each other, each trying to live as normally as possible under police watch. The case seemed to have hit another dead end. The investigative team strongly believed Mike and his son had been murdered, but they could not find the bodies, could not find the crime scene. Just when things seemed most hopeless, a surprising clue emerged from the most unexpected source: David Miller. Since his brother and nephew went missing, David had not been able to sleep. The release of Sarah and Rick only fueled his anger and desperation. In his frustration, he decided to return to his brother's house one more time at night. He did not go inside, just stood outside the fence, looking into the familiar yard, hoping to spot something unusual he had missed. And then, his eyes fell on the area of the old well, which was crudely covered by a few wooden planks. A memory flashed in his mind. He suddenly remembered a complaint from his brother Mike about a week before he disappeared. The two brothers had been having coffee together, and Mike mentioned that the water in the old well in the backyard had a strange smell recently. He had said it stunk and that he would have to hire someone to clean it out that weekend. This memory suddenly connected with another detail he had not noticed in his distress. The wooden planks covering the well looked very new, their color much brighter than the old, moss-covered stone of the well's edge. A well that suddenly starts to stink and is then hastily but carefully covered up. These two seemingly unrelated details suddenly clicked, forming a terrifying suspicion in David's mind. He immediately called Sergeant Russo to report it. This precious information became a light at the end of the tunnel for the investigators. That very night, Sergeant Russo called an emergency meeting. The entire team shared the same conclusion: they had to search the well. A request for an emergency search warrant for the entire property, with a specific focus on the well, was immediately drafted and submitted to the district attorney's office for approval. The next morning, before the first rays of sunlight, the police were once again at the house in Pine Ridge. But this time, they came with clear determination and a specific target. A detective's gut feeling told Russo that the answer to the disappearance of Mike and Kevin Miller was not in Florida or any other faraway place, but was lying silent beneath the stagnant water and deep darkness of that old well. At dawn on May 17, 2024, the quiet town of Pine Ridge was abuzz with activity. Dozens of police officers, along with a fire truck and a specialized vehicle from the search and rescue team, entered the small lane, establishing a strict security perimeter around Mike Miller's house. Residents, awakened by the commotion, came out to whisper and speculate. Sarah Miller and Rick Vance, after a night of tight surveillance, were required to be present to witness the entire process. When they saw the high-powered pump and coils of rope being deployed towards the old well, the color drained from both of their faces. They knew their act was finally over. Under Sergeant Russo's direct command, the search of the well began. An industrial pump was lowered down, its engine roaring to life, shattering the tense atmosphere. A stream of black, viscous, and foul-smelling water began to be pumped out, flowing through a long hose to an empty patch of land behind the house. Time passed heavily. The water level in the well gradually dropped, and the smell of death grew stronger, forcing everyone present to wear masks. Sarah stood there, her body shaking uncontrollably, her eyes glued to the mouth of the well in absolute horror. Rick, though trying to appear calm, had his cuffed hands clenched so tightly and beads of cold sweat on his forehead that they betrayed his fear. When the water level was reduced to a thick layer of sludge, the pump was turned off. A brave firefighter, dressed in a full hazmat suit and an oxygen tank, was slowly lowered by his colleagues into the dark pit. The entire scene fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the well. A few minutes later, the firefighter's voice echoed up from the bottom, muffled by his mask but unable to hide the shock, yelling that they had a body, at least two bodies. Even though they had prepared for the worst, hearing the confirmation of two bodies still stunned everyone. David Miller, standing a short distance away, collapsed to the ground, letting out a harrowing cry. Upon hearing the confirmation, Sarah screamed hysterically and fainted, and was quickly carried into the house by female officers. The recovery operation was incredibly difficult and delicate. The first body brought up was that of an adult male, wrapped in an old top. Despite being in a state of advanced decomposition after days in the water, through the work clothes still on the body, a grief-stricken David Miller recognized his brother, Mike. But the horror did not stop there. As the team continued to search in the black mud, they pulled up a second bundle. When it was opened, an even more tragic sight was revealed. It was the small, contorted body of 13-year-old Kevin Miller. The killer had been ruthless enough to murder an innocent child. The town of Pine Ridge was plunged into shock and outrage. The earlier whispers and gossip were now replaced by curses and damnations aimed at the two perpetrators. Their crime had transgressed all boundaries of humanity. With the discovery of both bodies, the missing persons case was officially a double homicide. Emergency arrest warrants for Sarah Miller and Rick Vance were executed on the spot. This time, there was no room for denial. While the two suspects were being transported to the county jail, the crime scene investigation and autopsies continued on a larger scale. The entire house was combed over by forensic experts. They found traces of blood that had been cleaned but still remained in the cracks between the floor tiles in the kitchen. A heavy wooden mallet, neatly stored by the stove, also had suspicious traces on it. The detailed autopsy results confirmed their initial suspicions and provided invaluable information. Mike Miller had died from blunt force trauma to the head and a sedative overdose. And Kevin, the most tragic victim, had died from mechanical asphyxiation. The bruising on his neck was consistent with strangulation. The killer had murdered the boy before disposing of the body. With the two bodies serving as silent but irrefutable evidence, Sergeant Russo knew the search phase was over. Now began the confrontation, the part where he would force the two demons in human skin to answer for their unforgivable crimes. The investigation would now shift from what and where to how and why. After the initial crime scene and autopsy work was complete, the investigative team had irrefutable scientific evidence confirming this was a premeditated double murder. The focus of the investigation now shifted to two interrogation rooms at the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Office, where the main suspects, Sarah Miller and Rick Vance, were being held separately. Rick Vance, with his cunning and stubborn nature, was assigned to a team of experienced investigators. But as expected, even when informed that the two bodies had been found in the well, he remained defiant, putting on a perfect performance of shock and outrage. He yelled, clutching his head, asking if it was real. Mike and the kid are dead? In the well? He questioned who could be so evil, and then asked if Sarah did it. He claimed she had a huge fight with her husband that night and called her an evil woman. He not only denied his guilt but skillfully shifted suspicion, turning himself from a suspect into a shocked bystander, an outsider horrified by his lover's crime. He created a narrative that he knew nothing and that if anyone was the killer, it could only be Sarah Miller, a wife who had brutally murdered her husband and child after an argument. Meanwhile, in the second interrogation room, Sergeant Russo worked directly with Sarah Miller. He knew that this woman, whose psychological state was extremely fragile and broken, was the key to cracking the case. Sarah sat there, her face vacant, her eyes soulless. The shock of seeing the two bodies being pulled from the well seemed to have drained all life from her. Sergeant Russo did not start with rapid-fire questions. He placed photos from the crime scene on the table, pictures of the bodies of Mike and Kevin. Then, he placed the preliminary autopsy report next to them. He began, his voice low and clear, informing Sarah that the science was in. Her husband, Mike Miller, was struck in the head and given a massive dose of a powerful sedative. Her son, Kevin, was strangled to death. Both were dead before they were put in the well. This was a premeditated murder, and they had every reason to believe that she and Rick Vance were the killers. Sarah said nothing, just lowered her head, her shoulders shaking violently. Russo continued, letting her know that in his interview, Rick Vance had denied all responsibility. He had said he never loved her and that she had seduced him. He claimed that on the night of the murders, he was not even at her house. Russo explained that Rick was trying to make her the mastermind and the sole perpetrator in this case, and asked if she understood that she was taking all the blame while the man who committed the crime with her was trying to walk away clean. The detective's words were like knives stabbing directly into Sarah Miller's already shattered heart. The betrayal by her lover, something she had likely already sensed, was now laid bare. She had betrayed her husband for him, gotten involved in a heinous crime for him, and now he was the one callously pushing her off the cliff alone. Sarah shook her head violently, denying it, then suddenly burst into convulsive sobs, a cry of pure anguish and despair. She yelled that he was lying, calling him a bastard. It was him. He talked her into all of it. Sergeant Russo urged her to tell them the truth, to explain why she could do something like this to her own husband and son. He encouraged her to tell them, to save herself and to clear her conscience. The final defensive wall in Sarah Miller's mind completely crumbled. She had no reason to hide anything anymore. She agreed to talk and tell them everything. And then, the memories of pain and guilt began to pour out. Sarah started by talking about her suffocating marriage. She admitted her husband was a kind, hard-working man, but he was also gruff, a bit of a traditionalist who did not know how to communicate with his wife. Their life was mundane, filled with financial worries. She, a woman who still had her looks and always yearned for a better life, grew bored and resentful. Then Rick showed up, Sarah said. He worked on the same crew as her husband, but he was completely different. He was a smooth talker, a flatterer, and had a kind of rugged charm. He saw that she was lonely and bored, and he started paying attention to her. Sarah recounted in detail how Rick had used sweet words and clever gestures of concern to slowly win her over. He complimented her looks, her cooking. He listened to her complain about her life. He brought her small gifts. These simple things were what her husband had never done for her. Sarah said through her tears that she was weak and fell into that sinful relationship. At first, she just thought it was a fling to relieve her frustrations, but Rick did not see it that way. Their secret affair lasted for a few months. Rick Vance did not just want a physical relationship, he saw Sarah as an opportunity. He began to plant poisonous ideas in his lover's head. Sarah confessed that he constantly put down her husband. He said Mike was a useless failure who worked himself to the bone but still could not provide a comfortable life for his family. He painted a picture of a better, richer life if he and she could be together. He said with her looks, she deserved so much more. Those words, like a slow-acting poison, began to seep into Sarah's thoughts. She started to see her husband through a different lens, one of resentment and disgust. The turning point, Sarah continued, trembling, was when he started talking about getting rid of her husband. One afternoon, right after they had been together, he held her and whispered in her ear. His voice, she said, she could still hear in her nightmares. The investigators in the room held their breath. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut and recalled that he leaned in and whispered that he felt so sorry for her, living with a husband like that. If only he disappeared, he had said, then they could be together openly. He would take care of her and give her a wonderful life. That demonic suggestion initially terrified Sarah. But in the long nights that followed, consumed by her hatred for her husband and mesmerized by the lavish life Rick promised, the idea no longer seemed so foreign. It gradually became a possibility, the only way out of what she saw as a dead-end life. The seeds of the crime had been officially sown in the soul of a sinful woman. Sarah Miller's confession continued, leading the investigators deeper into the wicked conspiracy. After Rick Vance planted the idea of eliminating her husband, Sarah was initially terrified. But Rick, with the cunning of a predator, did not push her. He was patient, using sweet talk, beautiful promises, and physical intimacy to slowly break down her final resistance. Sarah recounted, her voice trembling, her eyes shut as if unwilling to face the memory, that he kept telling her that as soon as Mike was gone, her life would turn a new page. He promised to give her a comfortable life, to love her son as his own. He said this would be their secret, that no one would ever find out. Gradually, she started to believe him. Her resentment for her husband and her desire for a better life had won out over her fear. Once Sarah had fully fallen into his sinful trap, they began to discuss a detailed plan. It was Rick who laid out every step, revealing a calculated and incredibly cruel mind. Sarah confessed that he said the best way was to stage an accident or a disappearance, and the old well in the backyard was the perfect place. He had checked it himself. He said the well was very deep and had been abandoned for years. All they had to do was push the body in and cover it up, and no one would ever find it. To ensure the victim could not fight back, Rick suggested using sleeping pills. He boasted that he could get a high-dose sedative, colorless and odorless, from an acquaintance. Their plan was to wait for a weekend evening when Mike had a habit of drinking a few shots of whiskey after a hard week's work. It would be the perfect time to strike. They also concocted the perfect cover story. Mike, after drinking, had an argument with his wife and angrily took his son and left. They later changed this to the Florida trip story, thinking it sounded more plausible. A few days later, Rick brought Sarah a blister pack of 10 diazepam pills. She sobbed that he told her to crush all of them and mix them into a bottle of white liquor. He said that dose could knock out a bull. At that moment, She knew there was no turning back. The moment her hand took those pills from him was the moment she put an end to her own life and her family's. After several days of waiting in fear and anxiety, their chance finally came on the fateful night of May 19, 2024. According to Sarah, Mike came home that evening exhausted from a day of masonry work. Seeing him tired, Sarah showed him an unusual amount of concern, a feigned affection that was chilling. She served a simple dinner with his favorite fish dish and brought out a bottle of liquor she had prepared. She told him to have a few drinks to relax, her voice so sweet it made her own skin crawl. Mike, completely unsuspecting, sat down and happily poured himself a drink. He could never have imagined that the wife he had lived with for over a decade was serving him his own cup of death. While Mike was eating, Sarah, with trembling hands, secretly poured the entire contents of the powdered sedatives into the liquor bottle. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She was so scared her legs felt weak, terrified her husband would notice. But Mike, tired from his long day, did not pay any attention to her unusual behavior. He drank the first shot, then the second. Soon, the powerful sedative began to take effect. He felt dizzy, his eyes grew heavy. He slurred that the stuff was strong tonight, before slumping over the table and falling into a deep sleep, a sleep from which he would never awaken. The house fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the frantic beating of Sarah's heart. She sat there, staring at her husband's motionless body, a chaotic mix of fear, guilt, and a sick excitement swirling within her. She knew there was no turning back. She tremblingly picked up her phone, unlocked it, and typed a short text message to her lover, who was waiting somewhere nearby. The message was only two words that sealed a man's fate and also marked the end of her own life. "It's done." A few minutes later, a dark figure appeared silently at the door. It was Rick Vance. He walked in, glanced at the unconscious man at the table, then turned to Sarah and gave her a sinister smile. The time for execution had arrived. Sarah's confession in the interrogation room brought the investigators to the threshold of the crime, to the fateful moment when the two lovers were about to take a life. Her memory continued to flow, thick with fear and guilt. When Rick Vance entered the house, he did not hesitate. He glanced at Mike, now lying unconscious in bed, and then signaled to Sarah. He went to the kitchen, picked up a heavy wooden mallet used for pounding spices, and together with Sarah, they struggled to move Mike, now limp as a corpse, fully onto the bed. But just as they were about to strike, a more horrifying tragedy occurred. The door to the inner bedroom suddenly opened. Kevin, their son, likely awakened by the noise, had gotten up. He walked out, rubbing his eyes, and froze when he saw his mother and Uncle Rick, his father's friend, standing over his motionless father. The boy was too young to understand everything, but instinct told him something was terribly wrong. He stood there, eyes wide, mouth agape, unable to make a sound. The child's sudden appearance terrified both Sarah and Rick. But Rick, with the instincts of a cornered animal, quickly regained his composure. He immediately recognized the danger. Rick hissed, his voice full of malice, that the boy saw everything. In his panic, he stopped thinking. He raised the wooden mallet and brought it down with a fatal blow to the back of Mike's head. A sickening, dry crack echoed in the room. Mike's body convulsed once, then lay still. Witnessing his father being murdered before his eyes, Kevin finally found his voice and screamed for his dad. That scream was his own death sentence. Rick turned to Sarah, his eyes now blazing with a terrifying cruelty, and said they could not let him live. Sarah shrieked no, lunging to hug her son. She pleaded with him to spare him, begging him because he was a son. Rick growled for her to shut up, shoving Sarah so hard she stumbled and fell to the floor. He yelled that the boy saw everything and asked if she wanted them both to rot in prison. With that, he lunged at Kevin. The terrified boy turned to run but was caught. Rick clamped one hand over his mouth while the other squeezed his throat. Kevin struggled desperately, his wide eyes pleading with his mother. Sarah lay on the floor, watching in horror as her son was being killed, completely paralyzed by fear. Within minutes, Kevin's struggle ceased. In the small house now lay two corpses, a husband and a child. Sarah Miller sat between them, her eyes empty. She no longer cried. Her soul had died in the moment she watched helplessly as her own son was murdered. Later, in the silence of the night, the two killers carried the bodies one by one out to the yard and pushed them down the deep well, forever burying their crime in the darkness. Sarah Miller's horrific confession ended. She collapsed onto the table, her body convulsing, completely drained of strength. The investigative team now had a complete, detailed picture of the crime. With her signed confession, they had the sharpest weapon to break Rick Vance's stubbornness. Faced with his lover's detailed account and the irrefutable forensic evidence, the cunning man finally knew there was no escape. He bowed his head and admitted to the entire crime, though he still tried to shift most of the blame and the role of mastermind onto Sarah. With confessions from both killers, the investigation was essentially complete. A crime scene reconstruction was conducted shortly after. Both Sarah and Rick had to reenact their entire criminal act, from the drugging and the murders to the disposal of the bodies in the well. The Oakhaven County Sheriff's Office quickly finalized its investigation report. The entire case file was transferred to the District Attorney's Office in early September 2024. The case caused a true shockwave among the public. The level of cruelty, especially the heartless murder of a child simply to cover up another crime, transgressed all boundaries of humanity. The case file was sent to the court. Justice was ready to be served. For a heinous crime that trampled on the law, family morality, and the sacred bond of motherhood, no mercy was deserved. The path ahead for the two killers was set. Rick Vance, the mastermind who used sweet words to manipulate his lover and who directly and brutally murdered an innocent father and son, would certainly receive the only sentence commensurate with his crime, death. As for Sarah Miller, the woman who, driven by lust and blindness, betrayed her husband, colluded in his murder, and finally, heartlessly witnessed and abetted the murder of her own child, even a full confession could not save her from the law's most severe punishment. Her crime was unforgivable. Her sentence would also be death. 2 death sentences were the inevitable end to a chain of sinful acts that began with dissatisfaction and an extramarital affair. The case is a painful and costly warning about the degradation of human decency. It shows that from a small crack in a marriage, from lies and secret trysts, a monster can grow, capable of devouring everything. The tragedy did not start at the well, it started with unresolved resentments inside the home. It did not start with a dose of sedatives, but with the poisonous sweet talk of a third party. And it did not end with 2 deaths, but with the complete shattering of many lives and destinies, especially the future of those left behind. The old well in Pine Ridge will eventually be filled in, but its tragic story will remain a painful lesson. Never underestimate the destructive power of betrayal, because once you plant its seed, what you reap may not just be tears, but blood, and a tragedy from which there is no return.